Chapter 2 of the Gospel of John, and we're now coming to a section of this Gospel where we're going to meet the Jesus we seldom preach. So far in the first verses of this book, we have been carried along and been shown some beautiful and great things about the nature of God, if you remember in chapter 1, and how he came down to earth and chose his disciples, and how he performed also his first miracle at Cana. Anyone reading these verses may have felt part of the crowd of his disciples and may have developed a sense of belonging with Jesus. But here, a harsh reality sets in, as each one is now carried to the point where he is brought to reevaluate his position and his relationship with God. Already we have been prepared by the question Yeshua asked the first two disciples who wanted to follow him. If you remember in verse 38 of chapter 1, he turned to them and he said to them, "What do you want?" Question that is still asking today. But here the Spirit is bringing us even further to reassess our position with Jesus. Because salvation is a very, very precious thing and comes only in this lifetime. There is then no room for errors, and the Lord wants to make sure you understand enough of it to secure your eternal future. This is what we're about to see today in the second chapter of John. And in this process, we're going to see that facet of our Messiah we are not used to see. The God who was on Mount Sinai with thunders and with smoke has now one more time come down to earth, and here he is about to enter the temple and come face to face with these men he so often denounced by the Old Testament prophets. And it is here in this chapter that a crowd of people was present and followed Jesus. And these people outwardly expressed their belief in him. But it is here that we learn something that disturbed many. We learn in here that they believed in his name and confessed his name. We are told that here he himself refused to enter in communion with them because he knew their hearts. So what does it mean to believe in Jesus? What does it mean to enter into communion with Jesus? This is where the reader is faced with a difficult situation to deal with. They believed, but he did not believe in them. How are we to understand that? These are harsh realities to consider, but they must be faced head-on, because this passage speaks about salvation. And what we're about to see is not meant for one to doubt his salvation, for salvation from the Lord is secured for eternity. And the very purpose of the writing of this book is for you to know that you have salvation forever. And it was also written for the unsaved to come to a saving knowledge of Yeshua. However, I believe that it does carry another purpose. It is a wake-up call for those who are flirting with God and are not concerned about their position in him. The words we're about to study are meant to bring them either to embrace him or to just live him. And this is, by the way, the scriptures. It is uncompromising, that is. It is sincere. It is to the point. And it is my prayer that what we're going to see today will bring us to adjust our position with God and bear more fruits. And I also pray that if anyone doesn't know the Lord Yeshua today, that he will give his life to him, because this is why this gospel was written. So after the marriage of Cana, we are now in verse 12. And there we read, "After this he went down to Capernaum, he, his mother, his brother, and his disciples, and they did not stay there many days." Capernaum, or Kephar Nahum in Hebrew, which means the village of Nahum, or the village of comfort. A name that is so fitting because the Messiah actually was there. This was the place that is called in Matthew chapter 9 his own city. At some point in time the family must have moved from Nazareth to Capernaum. This city, we are told in Matthew 4:13, is the territory of Naphtali and Zebulun. It's interesting because why actually these two tribes are mentioned right there and there in time. The verse says like this, it says, "And leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which is by the sea in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali." To his son Naphtali, Jacob prophesied in Genesis 49:21, He says, Naphtali is a deer let loose. And listen what he says here. He says he uses beautiful words. The Hebrew for beautiful is seper. It is a masculine noun indicating goodness and beauty, here demonstrated by beautiful, fitting, and appropriate words. It is from this territory where the ministry of the Word that was made flesh actually started, so it was so fitting. And to Zebulun, Jacob gave a prophecy that brings us right in the midst of the Messianic times. See what it says in Genesis 49:13 as Jacob spoke to his son. He says, Zebulun shall dwell at the heaven of the sea, and he shall be for an heaven for ships, and his border shall be unto Zidon. By the way, looking at a map, we see that Zebulun is nowhere to be found next to the seashore. However, we are told in Ezekiel that in the millennium, Zebulun is placed right next to the seashore, right at the entrance of Israel. So the mention of these two tribes and the city of Capernaum in the gospel is quite significant. One speaks of those beautiful words that will be spoken from there as the Messiah was there. Even more, and the other tribe speaks of the blessing these words will eventually bring to Israel, that is the establishment of the Messianic kingdom. And after that, John the Apostle brought us all along. He kind of followed a chronology, a 7-day chronology, as we have seen last week, from the start of John the Baptist ministry in chapter 1, verse 19. But in chapter 2, verse 13, the chronology stopped. And we are carried to an event that happened actually later on in the life of the Messiah. We're carrying at the time where he cleansed the temple. John now is not concerned with chronology, but with the message. And he so cleverly selects events in the life of the Messiah to prepare the reader for what is to happen in the next chapters. So after the wedding of Cana, which portrayed a reunion with the Messiah in the New Jerusalem, now we are brought back to earth and giving an overview of the situation in which Jerusalem was, a situation that led actually to the crucifixion of the Messiah. The Word was made flesh, and his own did not receive him. And see how subtly it starts in verse 13. See what it says. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Where is the sadness in this passage? Notice the words, the Passover of the Jews. Now who else's Passover could it be if it not the one of the Jews? This, I believe, is given in contrast to how the Passover was previously called in the Old Testament. It was called the Passover of the Lord. By this time it had become the Passover of the religious leaders of Jerusalem, the Judean. By now, man had developed his own religion, a religion that started with Hillel and Shammai, and was by this time so anchored in the mind of the people that the Passover became the Passover of man. And it is here that the prophecy of Malachi keeps its course. At the beginning of Malachi chapter 3, verse 1, we have a prophecy of the coming of John the Baptist. And in the same verse, we are told that the Lord will suddenly appear in his temple. He says, behold, I send my messengers, and he will prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Surprisingly, all of a sudden, the Lord will appear in the temple, and he did. And it was sudden not because the Lord did not tell them before, but because they did not know the Word of God, or they did not want to know the Word of God. And so he came suddenly. By the way, the two comings of Yeshua will come suddenly to the people because they are not waiting for him. Look at also in the second coming in Matthew 24, verses 38-39, where Jesus says, for as the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came. The people will then be surprised. In both instances, the people have forgotten that the real landlord will be coming back to claim his Jews. And how did the Lord find the temple as he suddenly appeared as the Messiah? Look at verse 14. And he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers doing business.